I'm Bethany, 34 years old, and I thought the worst betrayal from my family was behind me. But when my phone rang last Tuesday morning, my father's voice cut through 6 years of silence with a demand that made my blood run cold. Your sister Holly needs $45,000 for her fertility treatments, he said, as if those words should mean something to me. You're doing well now, so you need to help her. The same man who refused to pay for my life-saving heart surgery. Before we dive into this story that changed everything, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. If this resonates with your own family struggles, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. You won't believe how this family drama unfolds, so stick around because the next part reveals the moment my heart condition nearly killed me while my parents counted their money. 6 years ago, when I was 28 and working as a registered nurse at Denver General Hospital, my world collapsed during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday night shift. I was checking on Mrs. Patterson in room 312 when suddenly my chest felt like someone had wrapped steel cables around my ribs and started tightening them with a winch. The pain shot down my left arm like lightning, and my vision blurred as I gripped the doorframe, gasping for air that wouldn't come. My colleague Jenny rushed over as I slumped against the wall, my face gray and sweating. Call cardiology, I managed to whisper before everything went dark. Dr. Stevens delivered the diagnosis 3 days later with the kind of gentle firmness that comes from years of breaking terrible news. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, he explained, showing me the ultrasound images where my heart muscle had thickened so much it was choking itself. The walls of my left ventricle were nearly twice normal size, creating a deadly obstruction that could trigger sudden cardiac death at any moment. We need to do surgery within the next month, he said, his pen tapping against my chart. The septal myectomy will cost around $85,000, but it's not optional. Without it, you have maybe a year, possibly less. I called my father Frank that evening, my hands shaking as I dialed the familiar number. He answered with his usual gruff hello, and I could hear the television blaring some sports broadcast in the background. When I explained the situation, there was a long pause before he cleared his throat. $85,000, he repeated slowly. That's a lot of money, Bethany. Your mother and I have been saving for Holly's wedding, and we've got plans for that money. Besides, you're a nurse. Don't you have insurance? His tone was dismissive, like I was asking him to buy me a new purse instead of save my life. My insurance covered 60% after deductibles, leaving me responsible for nearly $34,000 that I absolutely did not have. When I explained this to him, his response cut deeper than any scalpel. Well, honey, you'll have to figure something out. Your sister's future matters too, you know. She's getting married next year, and we promised her a real wedding. Kids these days expect their parents to help with that kind of thing. The background noise from his television seemed to grow louder as he spoke, like he was already tuning me out. My mother Jennifer got on the phone then, her voice carrying that particular mixture of sympathy and annoyance that I remembered from childhood's scraped knees and broken toys. Bethany, sweetheart, you have to understand our position. We've worked our whole lives to save this money, and we can't just spend it all on one thing. Maybe you could get a loan or work some extra shifts. You're young and strong, you'll figure it out. When I tried to explain that working extra shifts was exactly what the cardiologist had forbidden, she sighed heavily. Well, you can't expect us to sacrifice your sister's happiness for your health problems. The conversation ended with my father suggesting I apply for charity care at the hospital, as if admitting financial poverty was preferable to asking my own family for help. I hung up the phone and sat in my tiny apartment kitchen, staring at the medical bills spread across my table like some twisted form of confetti. That night, I picked up extra shifts despite Dr. Stevens' warnings, pushing my damaged heart to its limits while my parents slept peacefully, their savings account intact and earmarked for my sister's perfect day. Holly called me 2 days later, her voice bright and cheerful as always. Dad told me about your heart thing, she said, the word thing making my potentially fatal condition sound like a minor inconvenience. That's so scary. But hey, at least you caught it early, right? And you're tough, you'll get through this. She chatted for 20 more minutes about wedding dress shopping and venue tours, never once offering to help or suggesting that maybe, just maybe, her wedding could wait while her sister fought to stay alive. 3 months after my diagnosis, while I was still struggling to find financing for my surgery, Holly bounced into our childhood home with a diamond ring sparkling on her finger and Grant, her banker fiancé, trailing behind with a self-satisfied grin. The engagement announcement turned our family dinner into a celebration that felt more like a coronation, with my parents fawning over every detail of Grant's proposal story. Within minutes, my mother was pulling out wedding magazines she had apparently been collecting for months, and my father was writing numbers on napkins, calculating how much they could contribute to make Holly's dream wedding a reality. $50,000 should cover everything beautifully, Frank declared, slapping Grant on the back like they were old friends instead of having met 20 minutes earlier. Our little girl deserves the best, and the Riverside Country Club has that beautiful ballroom that overlooks the lake. June weddings are magical there. Holly squealed and threw her arms around his neck, while my mother dabbed at happy tears with her cloth napkin. I sat at the opposite end of the table, picking at my casserole and trying not to think about the fact that $50,000 was more than enough to cover my remaining medical expenses with money left over. The wedding planning consumed every family gathering for the next 6 months. Holly had transformed from my younger sister into some kind of bridal deity whose every whim required immediate attention and financial backing. Designer dress fittings, cake tastings, flower consultations, musicians, photographers, and caterers became the constant topics of conversation. When Holly decided she needed a $8,000 Vera Wang gown because Grant's family expects elegance, my parents didn't even blink. When she insisted on importing white roses from Ecuador for authenticity, my mother clapped her hands in delight. Meanwhile, my role in this production was assigned with casual cruelty. "We thought you could handle the guest book," my mother announced during one of their planning sessions, not looking up from the seating chart she was arranging. "It's a nice quiet job, and you won't have to worry about all the walking that the bridesmaids will be doing." The bridesmaids, it turned out, were our 3 cousins plus Holly's college roommate, all of whom ranked higher in the wedding hierarchy than her own sister. When I asked why I wasn't included in the bridal party, Holly looked genuinely confused. "Well, you've been so tired lately with your health stuff, and I didn't want to burden you with all the responsibilities." The health stuff she referenced so dismissively had gotten progressively worse as I continued working overtime to pay for basic cardiac medications. Twice in April, I collapsed at the hospital and had to be taken to the emergency room, where overworked residents would stabilize me and send me home with stern warnings about rest and stress reduction. After the second incident, my father actually had the audacity to suggest I was manufacturing these episodes for attention. "It's interesting how these dramatic episodes always seem to happen right when Holly has something important going on," he mused during Sunday dinner, cutting his pot roast with deliberate precision. The breaking point came during Holly's final dress fitting in May. She had asked me to come along, supposedly for moral support, but I soon realized I was there to serve as an audience for her transformation into the perfect bride. As she stood on the platform in her thousands of dollars worth of silken lace, preening in front of 3 mirrors while the seamstress made tiny adjustments, she caught my eye in the reflection. "I'm so lucky Mom and Dad are helping with everything," she said, her voice carrying a strange undertone. "I mean, I know it's a lot of money, but they always said they'd do anything for their children's happiness." The word children's hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something break inside my chest that had nothing to do with my damaged heart muscle. Here was my sister, glowing in a dress that cost more than some people's cars, talking about our parents' unconditional love while I rationed my medication to make it last through the month. The seamstress continued pinning and tucking, oblivious to the emotional surgery happening 3 feet away, as Holly smiled at herself in the mirror with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. That night, I made the decision that would define everything that came after. I stopped asking for help. I stopped mentioning my medical bills during family dinners. I stopped expecting anything from people who had made their priorities crystal clear. Instead, I watched them celebrate Holly's engagement with the kind of joy they had never shown for my achievements, and I began planning my own survival with the cold calculation of someone who had finally understood the rules of the game. 2 weeks before Holly's wedding, I arrived at my parents' house early to drop off the wedding favors I had volunteered to assemble, hoping this small contribution might earn me some recognition in their elaborate celebration. The front door was unlocked, and I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, so I walked toward the back of the house with the boxes balanced in my arms. As I approached the doorway, I heard my name spoken in my father's distinctive baritone, and something in his tone made me freeze just outside the entrance. "The important thing is making sure Bethany doesn't get any ideas about the inheritance," Frank was saying, his voice carrying the authority he used when making proclamations about family finances. "She's always been the dramatic one, and with this heart condition, she might try to play the sympathy card. But Holly is the one who's going to carry on the family name, give us grandchildren. She's the one who deserves our legacy." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it from the next room. My mother's voice joined the conversation, her tone matter-of-fact and businesslike. "I've already talked to Harold about updating the will. Everything will go to Holly when we're gone. The house, the investments, Frank's pension, all of it. Bethany has her nursing career, she can take care of herself. Besides, with her medical problems, who knows how long she'll even be around to need an inheritance." The casual way she discussed my potential death made my hands shake, and I almost dropped the boxes I was holding. But it was Holly's response that destroyed something fundamental inside me. "I think that's smart," my sister said, her voice bright with the same enthusiasm she used for wedding planning. "Bethany has always been kind of selfish anyway, expecting everyone to revolve around her problems. And honestly, if she's going to have ongoing health issues, it would be irresponsible to leave her a bunch of money she might just spend on medical bills. At least if I inherit everything, I can use it to build a real family and create something lasting." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, during which I learned that my parents had been actively discouraging my doctors from pursuing aggressive treatment options, telling them that I tended to exaggerate symptoms for attention. They had also been spreading rumors among our extended family that I was becoming increasingly unstable and unreliable, laying the groundwork to justify cutting me out of not just the inheritance, but family gatherings and decision-making altogether. Frank's voice carried a note of satisfaction as he outlined their long-term strategy. "Dr. Peterson at the cardiac unit is a family friend from the golf club. I've mentioned to him that Bethany seems to be developing some psychological issues around her diagnosis, maybe even some hypochondriac tendencies. He agreed that sometimes the best approach is to avoid feeding into those behaviors with unnecessary procedures." My mother murmured agreement, adding that she had noticed I seemed increasingly attention-seeking since the diagnosis. Holly's contribution to this character assassination was perhaps the most devastating. "You know, Grant's family has some connections in hospital administration. Maybe I could have them put in a word about Bethany's job performance? I mean, if she's really as unstable as she seems, maybe she shouldn't be working with patients. It might actually be doing her a favor to force her to find something less stressful." The three of them discussed my professional destruction with the same casual planning they had applied to Holly's wedding menu. I managed to back away from the kitchen and slip out the front door without being detected, leaving the wedding favors on the porch with a note. That afternoon, I sat in my car outside an electronics store for 2 hours before finally going in to buy a small digital recorder. If my family wanted to play games with my life and livelihood, I needed to understand the full scope of their strategy. The recording device felt heavy in my palm, like I was holding evidence of my own execution. The betrayal was so complete and systematic that it took me several days to process the full implications. These were not spontaneous moments of favoritism or thoughtless comments made in the heat of emotion. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to isolate, impoverish, and ultimately dispose of me, planned and executed by the three people who were supposed to love me most in the world. They had not only refused to help save my life, they were actively working to ensure that life was as short and difficult as possible. 6 months after Holly's wedding, I had managed to stabilize my medical condition through a combination of medication, careful diet, and reduced work hours. My cardiologist Dr. Martinez had become an ally in managing my care despite my financial limitations, and I had slowly begun to rebuild my confidence both personally and professionally. When the head nurse position opened up in the cardiac unit at Denver General, it felt like the universe was finally offering me a chance to turn things around. The salary increase would be substantial enough to afford better treatment, and the position would utilize my growing expertise in cardiac care. I had been working toward this promotion for 3 years, taking additional certification courses and volunteering for the most challenging cases. My supervisor, Ruth Williams, had been encouraging me to apply, noting that my personal experience with heart disease gave me unique insight into patient care. The application process went smoothly, and I was selected as one of 3 finalists for the position. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November, and I felt more hopeful than I had in months. 2 days before my interview, Ruth called me into her office with a puzzled expression on her face. "Bethany, I received a very concerning phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your father. He said he felt obligated to inform us about some serious mental health issues you've been experiencing related to your cardiac diagnosis. He mentioned something about paranoid thoughts, attention-seeking behaviors, and concerns about your stability in a leadership role." Her voice was careful and professional, but I could see the doubt that had been planted in her eyes. The blood drained from my face as I realized Frank had made good on the threats I had overheard in their kitchen conversation. "Ruth, that's absolutely not true. I have no mental health issues beyond the normal stress of managing a chronic condition. My father and I have been having some personal disagreements, and I think this might be his way of retaliating." But even as I spoke, I could see that the damage was already done. The seed of doubt had been planted in fertile ground. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next week. My mother called the hospital's Human Resources Department, expressing concern about my increasingly erratic behavior and suggesting that the stress of my medical condition was affecting my judgment. She painted herself as a worried parent trying to protect both me and the patients under my care. Jennifer was particularly effective at this manipulation because she had worked as a school administrator before retiring, and she knew exactly how to present concerns in a way that would trigger institutional liability fears. The final blow came when Holly contacted the hospital administration directly. She presented herself as my concerned sister who had been trying to get me professional help for months. According to her carefully crafted story, I had been experiencing delusional episodes where I blamed my family for my medical problems, and she was worried that these paranoid thoughts were beginning to affect my work performance. She even provided specific examples of conversations we had supposedly had, painting me as someone who was losing touch with reality. The interview for the head nurse position was postponed pending an investigation into these family concerns. I was called into a meeting with hospital administration, human resources, and employee assistance program representatives. They approached the situation with the kind of concerned professionalism that made it clear they believed my family's version of events. Despite my protests and offers to provide medical documentation of my mental health stability, the perception had already shifted. I was no longer seen as a competent professional dealing with a chronic illness. I was now viewed as a potentially unstable employee whose family was trying to help her. Within 2 months, I was transferred out of the cardiac unit to a less demanding position in outpatient services, effectively ending any chance of career advancement. My hours were reduced, my responsibilities were minimized, and I was required to participate in regular check-ins with employee counseling services. The professional reputation I had built over 5 years was systematically destroyed by 3 phone calls from family members who claimed to be acting out of love and concern. The most devastating part was how believable their story was to outsiders. They had crafted a narrative that explained my family conflicts as symptoms of mental illness rather than evidence of their own cruelty. Anyone who questioned the situation was told that denial and blame shifting were classic signs of my supposed psychological deterioration. My family had successfully weaponized the mental health system against me, using institutional policies designed to protect vulnerable employees as tools for my professional destruction. By spring, the stress of the job situation combined with my ongoing medical issues had become unbearable. I was eventually terminated during a routine performance review, where my supervisors cited concerns about my interpersonal difficulties and resistance to feedback as evidence that I was not a good fit for the organization. The irony was crushing. The very medical condition that had sparked this entire conflict was now being used to justify taking away my ability to afford treatment for it. 3 months after losing my job at Denver General, I was sitting in my studio apartment calculating whether I could afford both my heart medication and rent for the next month when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end belonged to my cousin Rachel, whom I hadn't spoken to since Holly's wedding. "Bethany, I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for months," she said without preamble. "I know what Uncle Frank and Aunt Jennifer have been saying about you, and it's complete bullshit." Rachel explained that she had been at my parents' house for Easter dinner when Holly had bragged about how effectively they had handled my situation. According to Rachel, my sister had laughed about the hospital calls, describing them as necessary interventions to prevent me from getting ideas above my station. Holly had apparently been quite proud of her performance as the concerned sister, even practicing her worried voice for Rachel's amusement. "She said you were always too dramatic and that this was just giving you a taste of real consequences," Rachel reported, her voice tight with anger. More importantly, Rachel had discovered that my grandfather's will, which we had always been told left everything to my father, actually contained a specific provision for his grandchildren. Grandpa Robert had established a trust fund of $150,000 to be divided equally between Holly and me when we reached 30 years of age. Frank had been acting as the trustee, and according to the original documentation that Rachel had found in my grandmother's papers, I should have received my $75,000 distribution 4 years ago. "They've been stealing from you, Bethany," Rachel said, her social worker training evident in how she carefully documented the evidence she had gathered. "I made copies of everything before they realized I had been going through Grandma's papers. The trust distribution forms, bank statements, even correspondence between Uncle Frank and the attorneys. They've been using your money to fund Holly's lifestyle while telling everyone you're mentally unstable." Rachel connected me with her colleague Marcus, an attorney who specialized in financial elder abuse and family trust disputes. When I met with Marcus the following week, bringing Rachel's documentation and my own recordings of the family conversations, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is criminal behavior," he said bluntly, spreading the papers across his desk. "Trust fund theft, defamation, conspiracy to commit fraud, potentially even attempted medical neglect. Your family has committed multiple felonies against you." Marcus recommended that we start with a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen trust funds, then consider criminal charges depending on how my parents responded. He also suggested that I needed to document my mental health stability immediately, both to counter their defamation and to strengthen any legal case. "Get a comprehensive psychological evaluation from an independent provider," he advised. "Make sure it's someone who has no connection to your family or their social circle." Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist recommended by Marcus, spent 3 sessions conducting a thorough evaluation of my psychological state. Her report, which arrived 2 weeks later, not only confirmed my mental stability but noted that I showed remarkable resilience in the face of systematic family abuse. The patient demonstrates no evidence of the paranoid ideation, attention-seeking behaviors, or emotional instability described by family members, Dr. Chen wrote. Instead, her responses indicate someone who has been subjected to gaslighting and systematic psychological manipulation. Armed with legal representation, documentation, and professional validation, I began fighting back systematically. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the hospital administration, providing evidence that the family concerns raised about my mental health were part of a deliberate campaign to sabotage my career. He also initiated proceedings to recover my stolen inheritance, freeze my parents' assets, and pursue charges for the fraudulent use of trust funds. The transformation in my life was immediate and profound. Having a professional advocate who believed my story and treated my family's behavior as the criminal enterprise it was gave me back something I hadn't even realized I had lost, my sense of reality. For months, I had been questioning my own perceptions and wondering if maybe I was as unstable as they claimed. Dr. Chen's evaluation and Marcus's legal analysis confirmed that my family's behavior was not normal, not acceptable, and not something I had to tolerate. Within 6 weeks of retaining Marcus, I received a settlement offer from Denver General Hospital. While they admitted no wrongdoing, they offered to reinstate me with back pay and provide a positive reference for future employment. The hospital administration had clearly realized they had been manipulated and wanted to avoid the negative publicity of a wrongful termination lawsuit. I accepted the settlement but chose not to return to work there, instead using the financial breathing room to focus on my health and plan my next career move. The legal battle for my grandfather's trust fund unfolded like a master class in family dysfunction and financial crime. Marcus had filed suit in probate court, demanding a full accounting of the trust assets and immediate distribution of my stolen inheritance. My parents' response was swift and predictably dramatic. They hired their own attorney and began a campaign to paint me as a mentally unstable gold digger who was trying to steal Holly's inheritance out of jealousy and spite. Their strategy relied heavily on the narrative they had been building for months. According to their court filings, I had become increasingly paranoid and delusional since my cardiac diagnosis, fixating on imaginary slights and developing elaborate conspiracy theories about family favoritism. They claimed that my demands for trust fund money were evidence of my deteriorating mental state, and they painted themselves as loving parents who were trying to protect both their daughters from my increasingly erratic behavior. Frank took the witness stand during our first hearing with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged on his version of events. He testified that he had been managing the trust fund responsibly, making conservative investments to preserve the principal for both grandchildren. When Marcus pressed him about the missing $75,000 that should have been distributed to me, Frank claimed that he had consulted with Dr. Peterson, his golf buddy from the cardiac unit, who had advised against giving large sums of money to someone in my fragile psychological state. The problem with my father's testimony was that Marcus had come prepared. We had bank records showing that the trust money had been used to pay for Holly's wedding, her honeymoon cruise, and a down payment on her house with Grant. We had recordings of family conversations where they discussed cutting me out of the inheritance entirely. Most damaging of all, we had documented evidence that Frank had forged my signature on documents declining my trust distribution, claiming that I had voluntarily waived my right to the money. Holly's testimony was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire proceeding. She took the stand wearing a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a style clearly chosen to project responsibility and concern. Under oath, she maintained that she had been genuinely worried about my mental health and that her conversations with hospital administration had been motivated by sisterly love. But when Marcus played the recordings of her laughing about their successful manipulation campaign, her composure cracked completely. "You recorded private family conversations," she demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that echoed through the courtroom. "That's sick, Bethany. That's exactly the kind of paranoid behavior we've been talking about." But Judge Harrison was not impressed by her outrage. "Ms. Grant," he said sternly, "the court is more concerned with the content of these conversations than the method by which they were obtained. Please explain to the court why you found it amusing to sabotage your sister's employment." The turning point came when Marcus presented evidence that my parents had used my stolen trust fund money to purchase a luxury cruise and a new Cadillac Escalade. Frank had been telling the court that they lived modestly on his pension and had no significant assets, but the financial records painted a very different picture. They had been living well above their stated means, funding their lifestyle with money that legally belonged to me. Judge Harrison's ruling was comprehensive and scathing. He ordered immediate restitution of the $75,000 trust fund distribution plus 4 years of compound interest and penalties, bringing the total to nearly $98,000. He also awarded me damages for the emotional distress and career sabotage, adding another $45,000 to the judgment. Most importantly, he referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. My parents' reaction to the court loss was swift and vindictive. Within days of the judgment, I began receiving calls from extended family members who had been fed elaborate stories about my greed and mental instability. Aunts and uncles who had known me since childhood suddenly believed I was a dangerous, unstable person who was tearing the family apart for money. The manipulation campaign expanded beyond our immediate family, poisoning relationships that had taken decades to build. But for the first time in years, I had something more powerful than their lies: legal vindication and financial independence. The court judgment gave me the resources to afford proper medical care, and Dr. Martinez was able to schedule the cardiac surgery that had been delayed for nearly 2 years. More importantly, the legal process had documented their behavior in public records, creating an official record of their systematic abuse that could not be dismissed as family drama or misunderstanding. The money from the court judgment allowed me to start my own medical consulting practice, specializing in cardiac care advocacy for patients dealing with complex family situations. My personal experience with both the medical system and family financial abuse had given me unique expertise that was immediately in demand. Within 6 months, I was earning more than I had ever made as a staff nurse, and my practice was growing rapidly through referrals from attorneys and social workers who worked with similar cases. 6 years had passed since the court judgment that restored my inheritance and vindicated my truth against my family's campaign of lies and manipulation. My cardiac consulting practice had grown into a thriving business with 12 employees and clients across 3 states. The surgery that had been delayed for so long had been successful, and my heart condition was well managed through medication and lifestyle modifications. I owned a beautiful townhouse in Cherry Creek, drove a reliable car that I had paid for in cash, and had built a life that reflected my values rather than my family's dysfunction. The call that would test every boundary I had established came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was reviewing client files in my home office. My phone displayed my father's number, the first time he had contacted me directly since the court proceedings 6 years earlier. I almost sent it to voicemail, but curiosity and perhaps some remnant of familial obligation made me answer. "Hello, Frank," I said, deliberately using his first name instead of Dad to establish the tone of our conversation. "Bethany, we need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he had used throughout my childhood. "Holly is going through a difficult time, and she needs help from someone who can afford it. The IVF treatments aren't working, and the doctors say she needs a more expensive procedure. We're talking about $45,000 for the specialized treatment at the fertility clinic in California." He delivered this information as if it were a simple statement of fact rather than an outrageous request given our history. The audacity was breathtaking. This man who had refused to contribute a single dollar toward my life-saving surgery was calling to demand nearly $50,000 for his favored daughter's elective fertility treatments. "That's unfortunate for Holly," I replied, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "But I'm not sure why you're calling me about her medical expenses." The silence that followed was heavy with his disbelief that I was not immediately opening my checkbook. "She's your sister, Bethany," Frank said, his tone shifting to the guilt-inducing register he had perfected during my childhood. "Family helps family. I know we've had our differences in the past, but this is about giving Holly the chance to have children. You know how much this means to her." The phrase "our differences" was apparently how he characterized years of systematic abuse, theft, and character assassination. The minimization was so complete it was almost artistic. Within an hour, my mother called with her own version of the guilt campaign. Jennifer's voice was thick with tears as she described Holly's depression following multiple failed IVF attempts. "She's been trying for 3 years, sweetheart," my mother sobbed into the phone. "The doctors say this specialized procedure in Los Angeles is her last real chance to have biological children. She's only 34, but her egg quality is declining rapidly, and time is running out." The irony of my mother's concern for Holly's biological clock was particularly rich given her casual dismissal of my potentially fatal heart condition at 28. The manipulation tactics escalated throughout the week. Holly herself called on Friday afternoon, her voice small and broken in a way that I remembered from childhood when she wanted something from our parents. "Bethany, I know things have been complicated between us, but I'm begging you to help me," she whispered. "This procedure is my only chance to have a baby. Grant and I have spent everything we have on treatments that didn't work. I promise I'll pay you back once we get back on our feet financially." What followed was a carefully orchestrated family campaign designed to apply maximum pressure from every possible angle. My Aunt Carol called to express disappointment in my selfishness, having been told that I was refusing to help Holly out of spite. Uncle David sent a long email about the importance of family forgiveness and moving beyond past hurts. Even my elderly grandmother was recruited to leave voicemail messages about how proud Grandpa Robert would be to see his granddaughters supporting each other in their times of need. The psychological manipulation reached its peak when Frank called again the following Monday with a different approach. "Look, Bethany, I know we made some mistakes when you were sick," he said, the closest thing to an acknowledgement of wrongdoing I had ever heard from him. "Your mother and I have learned a lot since then, and we realize we should have handled things differently. This is our chance to be a real family again, to put the past behind us and focus on what really matters." His voice carried a practiced sincerity that might have been convincing if I hadn't spent 6 years understanding exactly who these people were. The final piece of their strategy was revealed when Rachel called to warn me that Frank had been contacting other family members, spinning an elaborate story about my success and their financial desperation. According to his narrative, Holly was suffering from severe depression due to her infertility struggles. Grant had lost his job during the banking industry restructuring, and they were facing bankruptcy if they couldn't afford this final treatment. He was positioning me as the wealthy, heartless sister who was allowing her family to suffer rather than share her good fortune. But perhaps the most revealing moment came during a conversation with my mother where she accidentally exposed the true depth of their entitlement. "Honestly, Bethany, I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this," Jennifer said, her voice taking on the edge of irritation that appeared whenever her manipulation wasn't working. "You don't even have children of your own, so what are you saving all that money for? At least Holly would be using it to create life and carry on the family legacy." The implication that my life had less value because I was childless was delivered with such casual cruelty that it took my breath away. After 2 weeks of relentless pressure from my family and their recruited allies, I made the decision to meet with them in person. Not because I was wavering in my resolve, but because I wanted to end this manipulation campaign definitively and on my own terms. I suggested we meet at their house on a Saturday afternoon, the same setting where I had overheard their conspiracy against me 6 years earlier. This time, however, I would be controlling the conversation rather than hiding in the hallway. I arrived at my childhood home armed with documentation that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. My briefcase contained copies of the court judgments, the recordings that had proven their systematic deception, financial records showing their theft of my inheritance, and medical documentation proving their lies about my mental health. Most importantly, I brought transcripts of every conversation where they had discussed destroying my career and stealing my money, professionally prepared by Marcus's legal team. Holly and Grant were already there when I arrived, sitting on the familiar living room sofa where we had opened Christmas presents as children. Holly looked genuinely exhausted, her face drawn and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for the sister I had once loved, before remembering that her distress was largely self-created through years of choosing our parents' favoritism over basic human decency. Frank opened the conversation with his practiced patriarch routine, welcoming me home as if this were a normal family gathering rather than an intervention designed to extract money from me. "Bethany, thank you for coming. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone, but family finds a way to work through these challenges together." His tone was warm and paternal, the voice he used when he wanted to project wisdom and authority. I set my briefcase on the coffee table and pulled out the first transcript, placing it where everyone could see the official legal letterhead. "Before we discuss Holly's fertility treatments, I think we should talk about some family history that seems to have been forgotten," I said calmly. "For instance, this conversation from 6 years ago where you discussed cutting me out of the inheritance because I might not live long enough to need the money." I began reading Frank's exact words in a clear, steady voice, watching his confident expression collapse into something approaching panic. Jennifer's face went white as I continued through the transcript, documenting their casual discussion of my potential death and their plans to convince doctors that I was mentally unstable. "We never meant those things," she stammered. "We were just worried about you, and sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're under stress." But her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears, especially when I played the actual audio recordings that captured their laughter and satisfaction at successfully manipulating my healthcare providers. Holly's reaction was the most dramatic. As I read through her own words about my selfishness and her hopes that Grant's family connections could get me fired from the hospital, she began sobbing uncontrollably. "I was young and stupid," she cried. "I didn't understand how serious your condition was. I thought you were just being dramatic like always." The phrase "like always" revealed more about her true feelings than any of her tearful apologies. Grant, who had been silent until this point, finally spoke up with the entitled tone of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Look, Bethany, I understand you're angry about old family drama, but Holly is suffering right now. Can't you put aside whatever happened years ago and help your sister when she really needs it?" His casual dismissal of systematic abuse and theft as old family drama perfectly encapsulated the mindset that had created this situation. I pulled out the financial records next, spreading them across the coffee table like evidence in a criminal trial. "Let's talk about what happened to my grandfather's trust fund," I said, pointing to the bank statements that showed exactly how my $75,000 inheritance had been spent. "Holly's wedding cost $38,000 of my money. Her honeymoon cruise was another $12,000. The down payment on your house with Grant came from my inheritance fund." Each revelation hit like a physical blow, and I could see Frank calculating how much I knew versus how much he could still deny. The breaking point came when Frank tried to reassert his authority through intimidation, standing up and pointing his finger at me with the rage he had always used to shut down challenges to his control. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, his mask of paternal concern finally slipping completely. "After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed, this is how you repay us. Your sister is suffering, and you're sitting here playing lawyer with a bunch of papers." My response was delivered in the calm, professional tone I used with difficult clients in my consulting practice. "Frank, you're confused about who owes whom in this family. You stole my inheritance, sabotaged my career, lied to my doctors, and spent 6 years trying to destroy my reputation and my health. The court agreed with my assessment and ordered you to pay damages. So when you talk about what family owes family, remember that you still owe me $45,000 in unpaid judgments from your criminal behavior." Jennifer collapsed into tears then, not the manipulative crying she had used during our phone conversations, but the genuine breakdown of someone whose carefully constructed reality was crumbling around her. "We don't have any money left," she admitted through her sobs. "Frank's been gambling again, and we've lost most of our savings. We took out a second mortgage on the house to pay what the court ordered, and we're barely making the payments now." Holly looked stricken as she realized the full scope of our parents' financial situation. "You said you would help with the fertility treatments," she whispered to Frank. You promised that if Bethany wouldn't help, you would find the money somewhere else. The dawning understanding that she had been used as a pawn in her father's desperate attempt to manipulate money from me was written across her face in real time. The final revelation came when I pulled out the last document in my briefcase, a private investigator's report that Marcus had commissioned to verify our parents' claims of financial hardship. The report detailed Frank's gambling addiction, their mounting credit card debt, and the fact that they had been lying to Holly about their ability to help with her medical expenses. They had never intended to contribute to her fertility treatments. The entire crisis had been manufactured as leverage to guilt me into providing money they planned to use for debt consolidation. So here's where we stand, I said, gathering my papers with the efficiency of someone who had said everything they came to say. Holly, you've been manipulated by our parents just like I was, but you chose to participate in their abuse rather than protect your sister. Frank and Jennifer, you've burned every bridge and exhausted every relationship in your pursuit of money and control. And all three of you are now facing the consequences of choices you made over years of systematic cruelty. The silence that followed my final statement stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I could see each family member processing the destruction of their carefully maintained narrative and beginning to understand that their manipulation tactics would no longer work on me. Frank was the first to try a different approach, his voice suddenly small and defeated. What do you want from us, Bethany? What would it take for you to help Holly with this procedure? My answer came from a place of hard-won wisdom rather than anger or revenge. I'm not going to pay for Holly's IVF treatments, I said clearly, looking each of them in the eye. But I will pay for something that might actually help her. Comprehensive therapy to understand how she became someone who could participate in systematically abusing her own sister. There's a family therapy practice that specializes in cases like ours, and I'm willing to fund a full year of treatment for anyone who genuinely wants to change. Holly's immediate reaction was predictable outrage. I don't need therapy, she snapped, her tears disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. I need money for fertility treatments so I can have the family I've always wanted. You're just being vindictive because you can't have children yourself. The cruelty in her voice was so familiar that it felt like stepping back in time to our childhood, when her favorite weapon was attacking whatever she perceived as my greatest vulnerability. Frank's response revealed that he had learned nothing from years of consequences for his behavior. Fine, he said, standing up with a dismissive wave of his hand. If you're not going to help your family when we need it most, then you're no family of ours. Don't expect any calls when your mother and I are dying, because as far as we're concerned, we only have one daughter now. The threat that had terrified me as a child now sounded like a promise of freedom. Jennifer's reaction was more complex, cycling rapidly between rage, self-pity, and desperate bargaining. She accused me of destroying the family out of spite, begged me to reconsider for the sake of her potential grandchildren, and finally resorted to the medical guilt tactics that had once been so effective. Your heart condition could flare up again at any time, she said with calculated cruelness. What if you need family support someday? What if you're alone in a hospital bed wishing you had been kinder to the people who love you? But the most revealing moment came when Grant finally spoke up, his voice carrying the entitled frustration of someone who had always gotten his way through family connections and financial pressure. This is insane, he declared, looking around the room as if seeking support for his position. Holly is trying to have children, which is a normal, healthy goal, and you're punishing her for some ancient family drama. No one cares about whatever happened 6 years ago. People make mistakes and move on. I gathered my things slowly, giving each of them one last opportunity to choose accountability over continued manipulation. The therapy offer stands for anyone who decides they want to understand how we got to this point and learn to build healthier relationships, I said. But I won't be manipulated, threatened, or guilted into funding Holly's family plans after what this family has done to me. My money, my choice. As I walked toward the door, Holly made one final desperate attempt to salvage her situation. Bethany, wait, she called out, her voice breaking with what might have been genuine emotion. I know I was wrong about some things, and maybe I did hurt you. Can't we just start over? Can't you forgive me and help me have the family I need? For a moment, I saw the little sister who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, and I felt the familiar pull of familial obligation that had kept me trapped for so many years. Holly, I said, turning back to look at her one last time, I do forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to fund your life choices or subject myself to continued abuse. Forgiveness means I'm not going to carry anger about your choices, but I'm also not going to enable them. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be going forward, and you have to live with the consequences of the choices you've already made. The drive home from my parents' house felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into brilliant sunshine. For the first time in my adult life, I had stood in that living room and spoken my complete truth without fear of consequences or desperate need for approval. The little girl who had once begged for scraps of affection from people who saw her as disposable had grown into a woman who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than basic human respect. 3 months later, I received a letter from Holly announcing that she and Grant were getting divorced. The financial pressure of failed fertility treatments had revealed deeper problems in their marriage, and Grant's family had apparently grown tired of funding their lifestyle. She was moving back in with our parents, who were facing foreclosure on their mortgaged home due to Frank's continued gambling and their mounting legal debts from our court case. 6 months after our confrontation, Jennifer called to tell me that Frank had suffered a stroke and was asking for me. When I arrived at the hospital, I found a diminished man who bore little resemblance to the intimidating patriarch who had controlled our family through fear and financial manipulation. "I'm sorry, Bethany," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong about everything." I sat with him for an hour, not out of obligation, but because I had learned that compassion and boundaries could coexist. Holly never took me up on the offer of therapy, but she did eventually find her way to a support group for people dealing with infertility and family estrangement. According to Rachel, who maintained contact with that side of the family, my sister had begun to understand how our parents' favoritism had damaged her ability to form healthy relationships. She was working as a substitute teacher and living independently for the first time in her life. The profound lesson I learned through this ordeal was that love cannot be purchased through sacrifice, manipulation, or financial rescue. Real love requires mutual respect, honest communication, and the willingness to see each other as complete human beings rather than sources of validation or financial support. The family I was born into had never learned these lessons, but that didn't mean I had to keep trying to teach them at the expense of my own well-being. Today, my life is built on relationships that honor my worth and reciprocate my investment of time, energy, and care. My cardiac consulting practice has expanded to include a non-profit foundation that provides financial assistance to heart patients from abusive families, because I learned that my experience, while painful, had given me unique insight into helping others navigate similar situations. The foundation has helped over 200 families in the past 3 years, proving that even the deepest wounds can become sources of healing for others. I've also found love with Dr. Martinez, whose patient advocacy during my darkest period had grown into friendship and eventually romance. Our relationship is built on the mutual respect and emotional safety that I once thought were impossible, and we're planning a wedding that will celebrate chosen family rather than biological obligation. The guest list includes Rachel, Marcus, Dr. Chin, and dozens of other people who have proven that family is not who shares your blood, but who chooses to honor your heart. The heart condition that started this entire journey is now well managed through medication, regular exercise, and stress reduction techniques that include firm boundaries with toxic people. My cardiologist jokes that cutting out my biological family was probably as therapeutic as the surgery itself, and my regular checkups show that my heart is stronger than it has been in years. If you've made it this far in my story, I hope it gives you permission to examine the relationships in your own life and ask yourself whether they truly serve your highest good. Have you experienced similar family dynamics where love was conditional on your willingness to sacrifice your own needs? How did you handle situations where family members expected you to fund their choices while dismissing your own struggles? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations help all of us understand that we're not alone in dealing with difficult family relationships. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with your own experiences with family manipulation or medical challenges. Subscribe to hear more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction and building the life you truly deserve. And share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding that it's possible to choose healing over history, boundaries over guilt, and self-respect over family approval. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that your story is still being written. You have the power to choose how it ends.